Hello, I'm Jack Freund, and I'm the head of cyber risk methodology for Visible Risk. I've been doing cyber risk quantification for going on 15 years. And this presentation is going to talk a little bit about how we have been thinking about taking some of that CRQ stuff and moving it into a global cyber rating. And Derek is my co-presenter here today, and he's going to introduce himself.
Thanks, Jack. I'm Derek Fadala, the co-founder and CEO of Visible Risk, which is a joint venture between Moody's Corporation and Team8. And I'd like to really kick us off by talking a bit about the idea that we need a global rating scale and we need a global way to rate companies from a cybersecurity perspective. I think this really stems from the idea that it's difficult to get a comprehensive view of cybersecurity risk, something that brings together various aspects of both the technical controls as well as the risk management side of cybersecurity, and do that in a way that is consistent, establishes peer benchmarking, really integrates financial exposure and measurement of, what are the adverse financial effects of a cyber event. And then finally, how do you objectively measure the security program and the security leaders that have responsibility for managing risk for the company? And being able to translate that into language that's digestible and understandable by non-technical executives and board directors, I think is one of the other compelling reasons why the timing is right to really establish something like this in the marketplace. Jack?
And it's not that there hasn't been solutions in these spaces before. And indeed, my own experience with cyber risk quantification has shown that we are trying to measure these kind of stuff. But what we really need is a blended approach. And let me talk a little bit about each of these 5 areas that have been working towards cyber assessments to date. The first is this traditional outside-in view of cybersecurity. These are your scanning vendors looking at externally facing systems that provide useful information of external attack surface, but gives you relatively limited view of internal things. And it also doesn't map it to any business risk. So it's sort of missing that connection to why certain audience members, indicated here in the center, might not particularly find this a compelling assessment type. A lot of companies complain about these types of scoring, not only because there is limited opportunity to fix things that are going wrong, but also because they're susceptible to being obfuscated by certain kinds of way and don't have visibility into things that are meaningful to that organization. One of those things might be, for example, operational technology. If the company under evaluation has this type of component to it, which is a key part of its business operations, an outside-in scan isn't going to detect that, not going to be able to see that. Indeed, this quote from Forrester here on the right that just came out a few weeks ago talks a little bit about how these platform measurements tend to miss out on an overall representation of a firm's cyber risk. Is it a part of it? We think so, but is it the whole thing? It certainly can't be. Organizations have been using management assessment for some time. This tends to rely on typically control frameworks or risk frameworks and tries to make an assessment about how connected these things are to an organization's cybersecurity practices. It's really based on best practices and certainly not a risk-based approach, but it does help organizations understand the connection between a cybersecurity program and strategy and where these things are measured and put into place. Oftentimes, these maturity-based views are used by CISOs when they communicate to their boards to indicate where they were and where they are to show progress towards a goal. Again, this is an element of an overall cyber rating, but it's missing the completeness of a global cyber scale. Complementary to an outside-in score is the inside-out score. You certainly get much better perspective on the control posture from the inside of the organization. There is a wide variety of approaches to this and tools, including scanning vendors that can provide these types of things. It tends to be highly technical, which requires deep and heavy translations for executives to be able to understand them. So the audience is very limited for these types of things. And oftentimes, even so, because of the wealth of information available about technical controls, it tends to not have that connection back to the business context and the business risk of an organization without some sort of translation layer in between. One can also apply probabilistic data models to this type of solution here. A lot of insurance companies and underwriters will use this type of approach to sort of understand what probable loss looks like for an organization. And in so doing, you get very useful statistical projections of what we think loss could look like for an organization. This is helpful. It does require significant amounts of data that's sometimes difficult for organizations to compile internally. And it also requires a significant amount of translation as well for executives to quite understand them. Although typical targets for this tend to include CROs, credit analysts also find this stuff very, very useful as well. And because this is sort of an end state assessment of what risk looks like, it doesn't necessarily have detailed views into what controls look like, or at the very least, it's baked in already, and there's very little room for adjustment to what those scores look like. The last one I'll talk about is the scenario-based stress testing. And this is used especially in a lot of financial-based organizations that are trying to figure out what their capital reserve allocation looks like and should look like for not just financial and credit risk and market risk, but also for operational risk. And this typically includes coming up with a set of scenarios or what-if statements about things that could happen and then assigning some sort of loss to them. And this way, it mirrors slightly the probabilistic data models, but tends to focus more on those extreme outcomes and doesn't have quite the same ability to measure in any sort of meaningful way what that control looks like to that without layering something else attached to it. So indeed, again, very, very focused on CROs and credit analysts because of the role that it plays in working on capital reserves for organizations. On all 5 of these, there's value. On all 5 of these, there's weaknesses. And the idea is that if we want to build a global cyber rating, we need to have the ability to see the way that all 4 of these stakeholder groups see an organization's cybersecurity. So we can walk up and down levels of decomposition to get very close to what reality looks like for them. And in this way, we think blending these 5 approaches is going to give meaningful output and into a methodology that can build a global cyber rating. Derek?
Thanks, Jack. I think when we're considering how to integrate these things together from a global rating perspective, we really think about it along the following lines, right? You have to make it holistic, which is, I think, a lot of what Jack just talked about, and bringing together these different areas, these different ways of doing measurements and evaluating companies. And you have to validate that data, right? And you have to be able to look at the data, understand which of it is relevant to the risk, understand what the different fidelity levels of that data are, and then bring that together into an independent and transparent model that is both focused on providing the outcomes and the answers that the stakeholders are looking for, but also has transparency into how those calculations are done and how you get from those inputs to the top level rating output. I think it's extremely important that consumers of these models really understand how organizations go from A to B in terms of going through that rating process and coming up with an outcome that makes sense from a methodology standpoint. So I think all of those things have to be brought together. And then, of course, having that financial focus and that peer benchmarking built into the output, I think, is really something that's absolutely necessary if you're thinking about building these types of systems and scales. Probably worth talking a little bit more about the data, which you could sort of think about as an overlay to the 5 areas that Jack was talking about in terms of, what are the components necessary to build this. He talked a bit about outside in. I think absolutely a component of global rating scales for cybersecurity. These are new and novel ways of looking at an organization, aggregating data from outside the company, open source intelligence data sets, scanning, other threat intelligence, and really organizing that so that it can be applied to individual companies. This can be done once you build the platforms to do it, and there are some successful businesses out there that do this. Can be done with very little effort once you build the core technology. But I think we all recognize that the fidelity level of that type of data can be very low if it's not paired with other information about the company. And so as we sort of build this sort of way of thinking about the data, the next piece is inside information. And this really comes in a couple of forms. The first of which I think is self-attestation data, right? This is data that the company already has, data that it can provide through existing reports or data that it can provide through things like surveys or interviews, traditional things that you would see in that management assessment category that Jack talked about. Very useful for setting baselines, very useful for understanding the scope and the playing field, but it really has to be strengthened both with that outside data as a validator where possible, and you really have to go inside the organization to validate the information with direct technical testing as well. I think this generally comes in two forms. The first is data query, right? Connecting to things like APIs from security technology or other IT systems and aggregating some of that information into risk metrics and signals, but also doing some empirical testing, right? Being able to sort of simulate adverse events in the environment and then collect information about the success or failure of those potential events and weave that together into the data model. So I think when you have all of these things together, you get to a very nice blended approach to data collection that I think is paramount to being able to establish a rating scale that, again, can be holistic and independent and transparent and really start to get to that peer benchmarking and financially focused output. And Jack will talk a little bit more about the modeling process there and how some of that financial focus can be brought to bear.
So what type of data do we need to collect at any one part of this model? And that's really what I think is really important. And so Derek talked about different types of data that we can collect, but to what degree and what depth. And I think it's worth taking a brief pause here to sort of talk a little bit about sort of the theory of modeling generally. And what you see here is sort of a continuum of modeling that you can sort of think about where you want to fall on this. And it's very easy to collect too much data. And this is where you sort of fall on this right-hand side here of over elaboration, over parameterization. When you've collected too much data, it sort of seizes up the system and the modeling to be too complex and too difficult. If you collect not enough data, it's clearly indefensible and fictitious. So the goal of good modeling really comes down to what they call a parsimonious model, which is a relatively simple model that has great predictive power. So what this kind of means is we want to collect and surface the most important signals about a cybersecurity environment that has the most ability to predict overall what we think a global cyber rating looks like for that company. This is an important theoretical stake to put in the ground to sort of understand that the goal was not simply to replicate existing compliance scans that exist in various forms already, but to pick from all 5 of those original things, the most important things that are really predictive and really explanatory about what an overall organization's cybersecurity posture and loss potential look like. So when you think about doing modeling this way, I built these next few slides to talk about sort of a hierarchy of how I think about it. And at the top here of what will be a pyramid here in a few slides is this general methodology. And this sort of provides a contextual framework for everything else that we're doing. And this is really where that top rating is going to exist. And we'll reveal that in a few slides. But you'll see at the top here, the sort of scale of good to bad and where everything sort of fits that we've rolled up from the very bottom. The next layer down I call rubrics, and of all the important areas that we think comprise a cybersecurity operational environment are going to have metrics in here just to measure and represent them in terms of the overall methodology. So these are sort of big picture containers for all the details that are below. And indeed, those details or scores come in 2 different forms. There's this raw score, which is literally just a piece of data that was collected about an environment, such as the number of domain admins that exist. And then the scaled score above it contextualizes that with some sort of denominator. For example, the number of domain admins relative to all admins or all users in a particular organization. And that's where this signaling comes in and becomes very important, is to what degree are those elements at the bottom indicative of the overall piece of that rubric that we're measuring, and then to what degree should that play in the overall methodology that comprises the score that we're coming up with. And indeed, it's important to wrap a process around this too. And what we really want is for that high level piece there to be relatively static over a long period of time, with changes in the rubric happening a little more frequently, and then at the very bottom, those pieces adjusting to the nature of the technological environments and as they advance. So you'll see more change at the bottom than at the top. This creates a certain amount of consistency for interpretation for the core audiences that we're thinking about in that stakeholder listing earlier. All of these are models, and we sort of try and piece these things together in a way that is meaningful and has a lot of rigor associated to it. Part of that rigor comes from the way that we're decomposing this modeling down from top to bottom. And that's where I think we should sort of start here. And this flowchart there on the left is think about which element we're trying to put together and put into place. Think about what the input formula output, that basic information system processing piece happens. We're going to take this piece of data, we're going to apply some sort of transform to it, and the output's going to say something meaningful about this particular area. We have to rationalize why that score exists and then sort of justify it. And I like this meme on the right there. It makes me laugh every time I look at it, but it sort of talks a little bit about different ways to measure temperature. And I like to sort of draw parallels between this and cybersecurity. Plenty of ways to measure different elements of cybersecurity. What we really want are the ones that are the most meaningful for the context for the context in which we're placing them. So sure, Kelvin is a very absolute sort of scale for that, but very not very useful for providing meaningful information about how cold it is outside. So for all these things that we're trying to do, it's important to think about the reality that we're trying to model at the very end, and then progress down from there. So if we think about something like threat, for example, and we're really worried about what a organization's threat posture looks like, we have to sort of decompose and say, well, when you say threat, what do you really mean? And then the answers to those questions become the next layer down in the model. And then you can get down to these atomic elements, these raw score pieces that allow you to roll these things up. For places where there's an existing model and you're trying to build these kind of things, it's important to leverage those where it makes sense and to contextualize them in the overall methodological framework that you're putting together. And at all times, it's important to keep in mind that it's a difference between asserting that you think something is indicative of reality and being able to test it and show proof of that. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but ideas of how predictive a particular control piece is to the overall model is very, very important. Something called back testing exists, where you look at the outcomes and you go back and say, I predicted that this piece was going to be indicative, and here's an actual outcome. How close to truth was I in that? And that forms part of the care and feeding of any sort of model to keep it relevant and up to date and highly rigorous and indicative of true reality in that way. Part of that requires wrapping process around it. And for anybody who's familiar with something called model risk management, this is sort of the approach that they take. It's a very meta approach to risk management. In other words, what's the risk that your risk model is wrong and how do you manage that? So really this comes down to sort of understanding and documenting things very, very well. What's the model? What's it there for? Why are we using it? And then decomposing it down through all of our documentation and assumptions. And I'll tell you one key giveaway that you have not really documented and worked on the rigor of your model is not identifying what the assumptions are. All models have assumptions, so calling them out, justifying why they exist, and trying to correct for them is really very important. And then you have to apply controls to the model, make sure that as you're putting it into production and applying it, that you're managing its output to make sure that it's relevant. And then what do you do over time and sort of wrapping an evergreen process around it to make sure that you have change control for the model, that the intention and use of the model has it shifted, and do we need to go back and adjust the foundation of that to ensure that the outcome still meets the needs of it? Now, all these pieces are important for making sure that a model has validity and value in the marketplace.
So let's zoom out for a bit and think about, once you've gone through this process of thinking about what the model ought to look like and what some of those underlying scores and measurements should be, what does the top level of that scale look like? And what are some ways to think about it? I think, when you look at, existing scales for scoring technology or cybersecurity, you tend to see things in the marketplace that follow a pretty typical kind of school grade type approach, 0 to 100 or A through F, or sometimes you see the kind of consumer credit oriented view. I think, one of the challenges with these types of scoring mechanisms at the top level is it offers some false precision, I think, in a lot of cases, but I think it also implies that there's an absolute sort of scoring to them when really it's a relative scale that most of these systems have at the top level. And I think that's the type of system that you want at the top level. You want to see that ordinal benchmark between organizations, and you want to have just enough positions on that scale to have meaningful differentiation and meaningful categorization, but not have it be so deep that you get into this false precision issue. So when we think about this, we think, a simple 8-notch scale, thinking about CR1 with a cyber risk leader, and then moving down the scale to something like an 8-point position, which would be the lagging bucket. I think this is relatable to that executive audience that we talked about before, because it does follow what's done in other business areas like credit or the new and emerging ESG style ratings and assessments. And so it's, I think, helpful to think about it this way. Doesn't mean you can't have absolute scoring that sits underneath this ordinal scale at the top. In fact, I think that type of absolute scoring at the top, at the lower levels, is quite important. And there are some areas that you might want to measure in that way, and even compare and contrast. And you might pull those out of the full rating model to offer some standalone insights. But I think at the top level, you really want to see this ordinal benchmarking in order to really understand how organizations that are going through the process are performing relative to each other. So I think Jack's going to talk a little bit more about how to go a little bit deeper on this and think about blending some of those other areas in a way that can make a scale like this meaningful.
Thanks, Derek. So these 8 categories, this 8-notch scale, we think represents that top cyber rating. We think that's where that methodology roll-up happens. Underneath that, at that rubric level of the model, we think these 4 areas are the ones that need to be measured and have representation in that overall score. Threat, governance, fortitude, and risk. We have a penchant for short terms, and we think that sort of encapsulate those things very, very well. I'm going to deep dive in threat and risk in the following slides. Let me talk a little bit about governance and fortitude. These are sort of the areas that you would expect them to be representative of, governance at least is representative of that sort of soft cultural elements of an organization's practices. How you manage awareness and where those things sort of fit in the organization. How often are you briefing the board? Fortitude represents a relatively common view of security controls, keeping in mind some of the modeling rigor that we want to wrap around that. The other 2, I think, really sort of help us decompose a little bit deeper, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the idea is that each of these 4 pillars offers some insight for different stakeholders, understanding that of all the stakeholders that we're thinking about, there's an aggregate view of this that goes all the way up and is representative of the entirety of the thing that we're modeling here. But the idea is that what we really want is views of each of these verticals to provide meaningful insight to some of our stakeholders that they can take action on, they can control them. In many cases, cybersecurity is a responsibility of several different verticals in an organization. And in some cases, those verticals have very little influence on the other. So we kind of want to be able to measure those things very, very well. So decomposing 2 of these rubrics down under threat and risk, this is sort of the area that we're thinking about in terms of building measurements underneath these things. And I'll start on the left here with the threat. We think there's 3 big elements underneath here that look like attack vectors, threat activity, and data leaks. And this can cover a myriad of things, and I've listed several of them underneath there. Sort of a view of what does the activity level look like of an organization out on the dark web and the things that are being talked about. And in some ways, these are relatively immutable. You can't control who is thinking about attacking you. But in other ways, it's sort of a measurement of the neighborhood that you live in. If you live in a bad neighborhood, sometimes bad things happen. And that's an important thing to reflect an overall score this kind of way. On the risk side, we think there's a role for traditional cyber risk quantification in here, but you have to provide a meaningful benchmark. We think coming up with a materiality benchmark to that helps us solve that problem. And that gives us the opportunity to look at what an extreme event would look like for an organization, and then also measure using insurance and other capital reserve measures what an extreme event looks like at the tail end of that curve. So if you had a very, very bad day and we had to dip into reserves and make insurance claims, how material would that event kind of be? And then at the very end, it's important to understand too that the frequency with which these events happen is also very, very meaningful and relative within a particular grouping of organizations. We think there's a large role for scenarios in coming up with some of this scoring. And I think one of the things that I find to be most helpful is a decomposition down from big picture things down to granular things. So on the left-hand side here, what you'll see on the left on the top there are the three big categories that we think the scenarios sort of group under. Your traditional business interruptions type of event, data disclosure, and then fraud. Decomposing these down, I'm a big fan of the Basel II framework for doing this to help organizations categorize what these losses look like. And then at the very bottom, attaching something like a MITRE ATT&CK framework to that to be able to say that we have attached these granular things that organizations care about at that security level, all the way up to that business connection at the very top, where people who are not technology savvy can look at something and say, I understand what business interruption is. I've heard of ransomware. I don't really know what firmware compromise is, but I get that these things are connected, and we can sort of make a representation about those things at the very top level. So this is an important way to think about, especially some of that scoring, and also attaching those control tests and those cultural evaluations and the threat pieces all together, so we have end-to-end connection top to bottom. Data can be very difficult to come by, and this view of our peer grouping is very helpful for doing that. So when you have this historical loss data that we have access to in different places, you can begin to sort of build out these kinds of concentric circles of data around organizations. Ideally, what we want to be able to do is measure you against cohort data, the companies that most look like you in many ways in terms of the type of business profile that you have, relative size in terms of revenue and or employees and footprint, things like that, as well as the same geography. Different types of losses in different types of industries require that we move out slightly more and move down. So depending on the industry that you're in and the type of loss, we may have to capture data from a different sort of filters to be able to make sure we can make a meaningful comparison without it being representative of other groups and not your group in particular. So using all this data, rolling it up into our organizational assessments, and then providing that sort of output is sort of what we're doing here with this model. So the idea is that I think there's value in thinking about the role that models play in your organization and thinking about what you can achieve on your own, applying some of the modeling principles I talked about here. And then sometimes there are roles for outside organizations to provide some view into that as well. So in order to have this type of rigor requires specialists that know how to wrap model validation work around the things that you're doing and accelerate maturity. Sometimes these are things you can do on your own, and sometimes they're things that are accelerated with outside help. Moving forward, if you're building a model, I think it's fully important that you think about some of the scoping elements I entered into conversation with you here about. For example, the methodology piece, the rubric piece, the scoring. What are we trying to do with this, and where does this fit in the organization? I can tell you in all the organizations I've spoken with over the years, very few of them have employed their model risk management groups to think about and to engage in cybersecurity practices. It's going to increase, and this type of maturity is really important for understanding where these things fit and the level of validation and rigor that we need to apply to it. If you're using that vendor score and sending it right to the board, that's something that requires probably a little bit of rubricing and contextualizing around to make sure that these things make sense when you bring them up there. And if you're going to submit to review this way, whether through an internal group or an external group, having that validation and that rigor around your assumptions is really, really important. And then what I would say a third here towards the end is even if you do build your own models, it's important to have third parties validate your models. I think about it the same way in cybersecurity, we advance our practice of encryption by routinely ignoring somebody who has bespoke and custom encryption that has not been exposed to outside scrutiny. Very soon, I think we're going to hit a maturity where doing the same thing with our security and risk models is going to also be viewed as ludicrous, and that without having that external validation is very, very important. So either contracting with your own outside specialist or engaging with model risk management teams to do something very similar internally, I think that's very, very important.
I think that's right, Jack. And in fact, it's one of the best ways we can help grow the expertise in this area, which I think will be quite important over the next decade. This is obviously early days in terms of shifting some of the measurements in cybersecurity from those sort of technical dashboards that we've been using for the last 20 years or so and into this sort of more risk-based approach with an economic view. And I think the data, which we focused on a little bit here, is also improving in that regard. And I think what we're going to see over the next decade in this space is pretty dramatic improvements in the accessibility of data to be able to do this type of modeling. And I think that's going to take the industry into a really good place in terms of how we think about this from a risk management standpoint. So, unlike other areas where this type of approach is applied, like property and casualty insurance or credit, we don't have those 100-year data sets to use to operate this. But the data sets are there, they're emerging, they're getting better every day. And we think that, the industry will, ultimately shift to this way of thinking. And I think it will take a village. And we think, good things to come in this space as more people get involved in it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what we've shown you here is part of how we're thinking about building such a global cyber rating. And in furtherance of our principle of openness and transparency, we want your feedback in this. We are going to be opening up the full methodology for comments and feedback here later this year. But this is sort of an early peek into what it's going to be. So if you have any feedback, please visit the URL there on the screen and let us know your thoughts.